Hello, and welcome back to my Rex's Wargaming channel. In this video, I would like to discuss the uniforms of the Army of Northern Virginia from the Chancellorsville campaign through to the end of the war at Appomattox. This part is going to be part one, where I'm really only going to discuss uniforms issued by the Confederate government, primarily items issued through the Richmond Depot, though I will touch on the output of smaller depots as well as imported items to some extent. So this is going to be our Richmond Depot Type 2 jacket. It's the same standard cut that you're going to see across Types 1, 2, and 3. It has a 4-piece body, 2-piece sleeve, 4-piece collar, 2-piece epaulets, 9-button front usually. It has epaulets and belt loops, both of which do not function. They're all sewn down. So this button here is purely decorative. If we look at the back, we can see the 6-piece, the 4-piece back panel construction. So we have a panel here, 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 2 in the front. The lining follows the same way, except you have 2 internal facing pieces before you get to the actual cotton, so you can see that there. There is a pocket, one small pocket internally here. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of wargaming. This is going to be really your more, not necessarily the most common type jacket, though I think it would be, but it spans the most time in the Army of Northern Virginia. So you're going to see these jackets really from 62 straight through to the end of the war. The only difference between this and what you'd call a Type 1 is going to be it doesn't have any trim. Though on some Type 2s you're going to see variations. You'll see 8-button fronts, sometimes 7-button fronts. Occasionally you'll also see them without the belt loops. That's something it's not unusual to encounter at really what we'd call Type 2 without belt loops. This jacket is what we call the Richmond Depot Type 1. The construction, this obviously comes before the 2, are really concurrent. I do not believe that every jacket was trimmed, but this is what we're going to call the Type 1. As you can see, it's the same construction, really, except this one has trim. It has collar trim. It's got trim on the epaulets. Now, the insignia, the chevrons, you're going to kind of see those throughout the war. They're just chevrons, but as far as the decorative trim, that's something we'd associate with the Type 1. And the Type 1s start in 62 and really run, I would say you're going to commonly see these up until about the Gettysburg campaign. Certainly not on everybody, but if I were going to represent a company for like war games, like an actual true size company, I might put a handful of guys in Type 1s, and sometimes something would start out as what we'd call a Type 2, and soldiers would actually add trim to it themselves. Now, the one exception I would make for seeing the trimmed Richmond Depot jackets through to the end of the war would be in the case of the artillery. You'll see a lot of artillery jackets that were either trimmed at the depot at special request or actually done after they were issued. So the troops would have had them either done them themselves or paid to have someone do them. And that's just something you see a lot more in the artillery batteries. I think a lot of the men who made up these batteries were more prominent type people. And this isn't really a true Richmond Depot jacket. As you can see, it's actually lined with a patterned cloth. And the inside pocket is actually here instead of there. Now, I do believe you do see some pocket variations where the pocket was on the other side, but I've never encountered a Richmond Depot jacket that's an original that was lined with anything other than white cotton. This one also does not have belt loops on it, but not every Type 1 or Type 2 did. They mostly did, but not always. Here's another representation of a Richmond Depot Type 2. The construction is the same, but you can see it's made out of this very dark blue-gray imported wool, and this is what they refer to as English Army cloth. If you ever read English Army cloth in sources, this is it, and this is pretty typical of the English Army cloth. It was quite dark. It was so dark, in fact, that when Longstreet's men fought at the Battle of Chickamauga, and they show up in this English Army cloth, they'll actually be confused for Federal soldiers, because the soldiers out west on the Western Theater in Georgia were not used to seeing men in uniforms this dark. Something else we can see, it actually has wooden buttons, and these are 4-hole wooden buttons. You'll also see a 2-hole variety. And that really begins to come in, I think, in 1863, but they'll also be used alongside brass buttons. I mean, the wooden buttons and brass buttons will be used together on jackets as they are available throughout the war. And you'll really start to see these English Army cloth jackets show up, I would say, in early 1863, about the Chancellorsville campaign. At that point, I might put, on a given unit, any unit, randomly, I may put, 10-15% in the English Army cloth jackets, just increasing as the war goes on. Gettysburg, maybe 20-25% of the guys, and increasing the ratio as the war goes on. The domestic jean cloth jackets will never actually disappear. but you're going to start to see a lot more of these English Army cloth jackets. And this one is the Type 2. As you can see with the belt loops and the epaulets. The Type 2 never actually goes really out of production. They'll keep making Type 2s kind of right to the end, alongside the next jacket, which I'm going to show. Actually, it's another Type 2, but I'm going to show a Type 3 after that. Here's another Type 2 I have. It's a little bit different. It has 2-hole wood buttons, and it does not have the belt loops. As you can see, a lot of Type 2s didn't have them. They usually did, but not always. It wasn't super consistent. And you will start to see 8-button fronts and rarely 7-button fronts. But in this one's a little bit, it's still English Army cloth, but a little bit lighter, less blue. But the one thing consistent with the English Army cloth, and even today, it's incredibly dark. Even uniforms that were worn in the field that we still have in collections are dark. They don't really fade. It was very high quality. English wool was, the output of their mills. It had good dye. It was very color fast. The same cannot really be said of the jean cloth, which would fade, and I'll talk about that with the next jacket. But you can see this, and this jacket, and they did fit very, very tight. You can see the seams on this one actually a little bit better. I really like this jacket. It's really fantastic. Now this is an example of a Richmond Depot Type 3, and this is the only one I have in my collection. And it's a copy of a jacket that's not really typical, but they did exist. And so the body construction, the overall construction of a Type 3, Type 1, and Type 2 are the same. The only difference is they completely omitted the epaulets, and they don't have belt loops on them. None of them do. But there is one example that does have some collar trim that I believe was added later on. Now, with the Type 3s, typically you'll hear people say that they were never made in domestic cloth, like jean cloth, like this one here. But we do know there is one that's made in jean cloth, and oddly enough, that one does have a small amount of cording around the collar that's red. And it's provenance to an artilleryman in the Army of Northern Virginia. So when you try not to say never, because when you do that, something will pop up to prove you wrong. But the overwhelming majority of Type 3 jackets, except for one that we know of, would have been made in the English Army cloth. So it would have been that same wool I showed before. But this one, I had it done, and it's in jean cloth, and it's very typical of the one that does survive in jean cloth. I didn't have cording added around it. I didn't want to go that far because we don't believe the original jacket had the cording. We believe that was a later addition. And you can see the color of this is what people describe as that tan butternut color. And that's something I wanted to address because I hear this pop up a lot of times. And it's not that Confederate uniforms were never made in tan or brown colors, but oftentimes they were gray. And they were dyed with dyes that were natural dyes. They were not very color fast. They oxidized quite quickly, things like logwood. And so a lot of the jackets that were this color, being described as, in some period sources, as the color of wheat, they're pretty dark. They would start out that color. This is a cadet gray jean cloth that's been dyed. And they would start out that dark, and over a period of 6 to 8 weeks out in the sun, in the rain, the dye just wasn't good, and it would oxidize, and it would fade very, very quickly. And you'd end up with something that's the color of wheat. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind with the Confederate troops, is that when you're talking about, especially with domestic cloth, when it would come out, it would depend on how long the unit's been in service. Everything really, by regulation, I believe, should have been gray coming out of the Richmond Depot. But within a period of 6 to 8 weeks, depending on the weather, after those troops were issued those uniforms, they may be the color of wheat. They may be tan, like this jacket is, and like the original one this is copied off is tan. Now, you can still get logwood dyed jean cloth. It's a little more expensive. And for the purposes of a wargamer, it really doesn't matter. You're not making jackets unless you want to, and it's a worthwhile thing to have a nice jacket. I mean, the RD Richmond Depot 2, the first one I showed, is one I actually made myself, and it was a very fulfilling experience. But going on to the last jacket I have, which is not a Richmond Depot type jacket. It's actually kind of one of the oddballs within the Depot system for the Army of Northern Virginia. This is going to be our really last type of clothing that I would describe as being an issue item from the Army of Northern Virginia, and it's what's kind of vaguely described as a sack, a 4-button sack, for lack of a better name. And there's a lot we don't know about them. We believe they're all very late war, so late 1864 or 1865. There's only 4 known to survive. They're all made in domestic jean cloth like this. There's one that's made in unbleached, undyed cloth, like the one I have here. The other 4 are made in gray dyed jean cloth. The one that's made in this white cloth is actually in the Museum of the Confederacy. I'm not sure what they call it now. They changed the name. It has collar trim that was added most likely after it was issued. It has black collar trim. So we're not really There's just not a lot we really know about them. What we do know is they all have a big one piece, basically what we'd call a dog ear sleeve. It's quite wide. They have a very loose fitting 4-piece body. They have one pocket that has an external opening, 4-button front, I said 4-piece body, 4-piece collar. They don't fit well, and there's just not a lot we know about them. I don't know that anyone makes miniatures specifically in a coat that looks like this. We just really don't have any good idea. But this is one that I did have made for me. I really liked it. And it just, one of those things I mentioned, I was actually in Napoleonic Wargaming's live stream. I was in the comment section, and I mentioned that sometimes Confederate troops had off-white or white uniforms, and that's something to keep in mind. The Army of Northern Virginia at least would have had one, in 1864, 1865. There's at least one guy wearing it, if not more. So we don't know a lot about these jackets. We do not believe that they are a product of the Richmond Depot, perhaps one of the smaller Confederate depots elsewhere in Virginia. What we do know, we have 4 of these jackets surviving, and I believe 2 are ID'd to soldiers in the Army of Northern Virginia, and the other 2 don't have provenance. So, we really don't know where they're from, but they're most likely just not provenance examples, but they were part of the same production because they all share the same features. And that's, kind of going on to something else I wanted to say as far as cloth. Beginning, I would say in late 1862, you start to see, and at least in the Army of Northern Virginia, you start to see the use of the English Army cloth, the dark blue-gray wool. Before that, it's really jean. You do see some wool, but it's for the issue uniforms, it's mostly domestic jean cloth, and in varying shades of gray, fading to tan. But the use of domestic cloth like this jean cloth will continue on throughout the war for even jackets and trousers and caps. You're going to see it throughout. As the war goes on, for at least the Richmond Depot jacket, the English Army cloth really becomes the predominant cloth they use for that, with trousers being, the trousers are a real mix of English Army cloth, domestic jeans, and French blue wool. Kind of in equal numbers, I would say. The same goes for the caps, maybe given the edge to the English Army cloth production for caps. But for jackets, it is mostly the English Army cloth, really, in 64 and 65. But it starts in late 62, becoming common in 63. And so I can give proportions that I would estimate. I would say from Chancellorsville, maybe 10-15%, Gettysburg 25-30%, and by the campaigns of 64, half to 65%, 75%. As the war goes on, just increase. But you're always going to see some domestic cloth, and so it makes sense to at least put a few guys in domestic cloth uniforms if you're going to represent an Army of Northern Virginia force for wargaming in any of those periods. Worth also looking at is trousers, and this is a pair of trousers copied from a pair of Richmond Depot trousers, which were made in French blue. And you really start to see this color come in around the Gettysburg campaign. And it stays pretty heavy in use really through like mid-64, I'd say. It never really completely disappears from the Army, but it does go out in favor of the English Army cloth, which is being imported in much greater numbers than this cloth. But you're going to see trousers of the same basic pattern produced from 1863 in this French blue wool, the blue-gray English Army cloth, and gray jean cloth. That will also fade to tan. So for trousers for Confederate troops from 63 on, you have a good mix. And I would say you could include a large number of even these blue ones in a late war, Army of Northern Virginia force. You'd be fine. And you're going to see a lot of the bone buttons. You'll sometimes see, I believe, japanned iron buttons on them. But, at 28 mil or even smaller, you're not going to be painting the suspender buttons on the trousers. So it doesn't matter. But again, this is a very rich blue. And Longstreet's men, when they were at Chickamauga, they showed up a large proportion of the soldiers in these blue trousers and those very dark blue-gray English Army cloth Richmond Depot jackets. You can see why they caused confusion in the local Confederate forces, as they'd never seen anyone in uniforms quite that dark. They mistook them for Federal troops, I should say. The next thing I'd like to talk about will be issued hats and caps, and by far, and really every Confederate army, every Confederate field army, the majority of soldiers are going to be wearing a hat. Now, in the Army of Northern Virginia, and probably other armies too, the predominant color, the preferred color, was going to be black. The Confederate government imported a lot of hats from Britain and France. They made hats in the Confederacy, and they preferred to make them in black. And so here's a pretty typical hat. The way the soldier would shape it would really depend on his own personal taste. I've shaped mine this way. But the majority of the soldiers are going to be wearing a hat, and that hat's going to be black. There's still going to be a lot of light colored hats and brown hats, but most hats ought to be black. They ought to be undecorated, so no cords, no brass. You may see some of that, but not a great deal. It's maybe a little overrepresented today. Hats make up a minority, but a sizable minority, and in some units, hats are the majority, and I'll get into that next. Something you're going to see a sizable minority of within the Army of Northern Virginia and most other Confederate armies is going to be caps. They're going to really be of the chasseur type, the low type, instead of the more voluminous Federal forged cap. That you will see some forged cap copies on Confederate troops. I don't believe that they're the output of the Richmond Depot. I believe the Depot only made chasseur type caps like this, or what we'd call kepis. This is one made in domestic cloth, and the cloth is actually a pretty good match, though not exactly the same as the jacket. And they wouldn't be. And it's just as a side note, when they were sending out cloth to make into jackets or caps or trousers, they would cut them at the depot, and then they would send those cut kits out to a lot of times to larger firms that made clothing, or sometimes to individuals. They'd let it out to individual seamstresses, and they would sew them together, but they wouldn't come back together. They would come back in the order in which they were finished. So if you sent some very dark cadet gray jean out that was cut for jackets, 200 kits, and then you sent out some that are in a slightly lighter or even a khaki color to be cut as kits, you wouldn't receive them back at the same time. So if you're bundling 100 together, for instance, you're going to get what comes back in whatever order it comes back in. And so that's why when soldiers were issued clothing, they would often be issued, clothing that's new and of a certain pattern, but it'd be mixed kind of cloth, mixed shades. That's how it was done, and the same for caps. And you can see this cap here specifically has a painted cloth visor, and it's actually been bound, because with the painted cloth you had to bind it because it's just like pasteboard. It actually has painted cloth. This isn't a leather strap, it's painted cloth, and the button is actually just japanned iron. That's pretty typical. This is a pretty, not a low quality construction, but the materials are not the best. A better cap that you would actually see be really beginning in 1863 would be one in English Army cloth. And here's an absolutely fantastic cap made in that English Army cloth I was telling you about. Now this shade is not quite the same as either of my jackets, and it's going to be a theme even with modern uniforms. You get some modern uniforms together and you look at the shades, they're not exactly the same, but it's an idea of a shade. You want it to be the dark blue gray, and that's what this is. And this cap, not only is it wool, so it's a better material, but it's a leather visor, it's got a leather chin strap, it's got nice script eye buttons, which would have been English imports. They imported a lot of buttons from Great Britain of various designs, and I can recommend books on that, and I will, if I remember, to put it in at the end of the video. But you're going to start seeing these caps really from 1863, very common throughout the end of the war. Worn alongside the domestic cloth and the hats, and the black hats and hats of various colors. So if you want to do a good representation of the Army of Northern Virginia, really from the Gettysburg campaign on, yeah, add some of these, at whatever proportion you like. I mean, you do want to keep the majority of your men in black hats, but yeah, if you want to add in a couple of these, that would absolutely make sense. It would look right. The next cap I'd like to talk about is an artillery cap. This is going to be the one part of Confederate uniforms in the Army of Northern Virginia, at least, that we're going to see in branch colors, not more often than not, but more often than you're going to see in any of the other branches. The artillery, often you're going to see artillery, especially in units like the Washington Artillery of New Orleans, and other prominent batteries. They're going to have a lot of red trim, or not some, I wouldn't say a lot, but certainly more than you're going to find black trim in infantry units. They're more, I think they have a lot of prominent citizens and prominent individuals serving in those units, and so they want to look good. They want to be well turned out. And so this is a typical, one of the typical designs you're going to see coming out of the Richmond Depot. It's just really much the same as the other cap. It has a painted cloth chin strap, painted cloth visor that's been bound. It has pasteboard. This has both red wool, but also jean cloth. The band and the crown are gray jean cloth or domestic cloth. The buttons are going to be these lined really nice. These are actually gilt buttons, and they would have been a type of button imported from Great Britain. You also see these done with the gray that's not domestic cloth but English Army cloth. You'll see the colors reversed, where the body will be gray and the crown and band will be red. So you're going to see those variations, both the colors reversed as well as the cloth sometimes being English Army cloth, sometimes being domestic jean cloth. And you're going to see these a bit more in the artillery. You don't really see, I've never seen one. I'm not going to say they don't exist, but I've never seen anything trimmed yellow for cavalry. in the ANV at least. And I will talk about briefly the infantry. This is going to be the last cap, another Richmond Depot cap, and this one is made in wool. It is made with English Army cloth and a French blue type wool for the trim. And this is a cap very specific to the Maryland Battalion, the second Maryland Battalion, 2nd Maryland Regiment, which is the Marylanders. They were really just a battalion. They never really achieved full regimental size, but they were a unit that was described really at least from 1862 as being incredibly well turned out for Confederate troops. I mean, Union prisoners in Winchester will comment on it that these guys are some of the best looking Confederate troops they've seen as far as consistency in their uniforms, and they are very uniform. Now you're not really going to see these caps worn with this type of jacket. The Marylanders really from the Gettysburg campaign on were almost completely uniformed in English Army cloth jackets, so the dark blue gray, and even usually the trousers as well in the caps, and so they would have been very well turned out in wool uniforms. And this one's a little bit nicer. It's got, it's the English Army cloth body with a French blue wool, crown and band. This one has federal buttons, as they sometimes did. But this one actually has a leather visor that's still bound. It's like almost officer quality, leather chin strap. You will sometimes see them with Maryland buttons. But I believe, and after discussing with a number of people, that a lot of those perhaps are later additions to the uniforms, maybe post-war additions by veterans. And certainly some guys would have had some of their Maryland buttons during the war, but how good the supply of those would have been really is subject to much debate. But really, when you see these, and actually now I'm going to do it so you can actually see it the way it ought to be. So this is much better. This is exactly how a Marylander from the 1st Maryland Battalion, 2nd Maryland Regiment, same unit, from the Gettysburg campaign on, this is how they should be turned out. This, and if I had a pair of English Army cloth trousers, normally, with maybe a small amount of trousers and domestic jean cloth, so a little bit lighter gray or sometimes fairly dark or even tan, and some of the French blue trousers, but I would say really, I would put 90+%. If I was going to paint Marylanders, I would do 90% plus in English Army cloth trousers with English Army cloth jackets, really for everybody, and the caps for everybody. Even the officers, I would keep everybody in the caps. The Marylanders were known, they were very, very, very natty, very sharp-looking troops. And it doesn't really matter if you're going to have an English, with your English Army cloth, it can be a Richmond Depot Type 2 or 3. It doesn't matter necessarily if it has the epaulets. You'd like to strive for brass buttons. The Marylanders did take pride, as often as they could, as having Maryland buttons, Maryland State brass buttons on the uniform. But that wasn't always possible. But they did they did at least have enough ability to keep themselves in very high quality wool uniforms almost completely through to the end of the war. And so this is really the first part of a primer I'd like to do on uniforms of the Army of Northern Virginia from the Chancellorsville campaign through to the end of the war. And in the next video, I'm probably going to cover non-Richmond Depot uniforms, so state issue uniforms and some of the commutation stuff that men had on their kind of by themselves, getting on their own ability. But this is really, most of the troops, this should cover most of what you have to paint. The majority of the soldiers, really from the Chancellorsville campaign on, they were wearing depot-issued uniforms. The states didn't really have the ability to provide some of these guys with uniforms, especially the men from places like Louisiana and Texas. That just wasn't possible. With the exception of North Carolina, not a lot of guys were getting state-issued clothing. And so they were relying on the federal government for their clothing, or the Confederate, federal government, the Confederate government. And so this is really the first part from Chancellorsville to the end of the war of the Richmond Depot issued clothing. And at least for that one 4-button kind of sack coat, just issue clothing. We're not really sure what depot it came from. Next, I'll talk about really the timeline of these uniforms and books I'm going to recommend, and that should wrap up the first video. Now, if I had to put these uniforms in a timeline, let's start here with the Richmond Depot Type 1, of which this is a similar type of jacket. Visually, it's very similar. I would put these really from the beginning of 1862 through to the end of the Gettysburg campaign. Not all of them would have necessarily started out trimmed. People would have added trim to them, but we can say this style would have been seen really through to the end of the Gettysburg campaign, though from 1863 it wouldn't have been seen in huge numbers. And what we're looking for is really just trim on the epaulets and on the collar. Now you are going to see, especially in the artillery, You will see people trimming later type jackets, even Richmond Depot Type 3s and Tate jackets, adding trim to Tate jackets. The Richmond Depot Type 2 jacket seen here, which is the same as the Type 1 without trim, these are they're going to run concurrent to the Type 1, so really from early 62, but really to the end of the war. A complete suit of clothing in domestic cloth would have been seen like this from 1862, and some numbers until 1865 at Appomattox, though from the Chancellorsville campaign, you will start to see numbers of the jackets and caps and even trousers made in this English Army cloth. You also see the wood buttons come in around the same time. But it doesn't mean that they aren't making, domestic cloth jackets with brass buttons or English Army cloth jackets with brass buttons at the end of the war. The caps, really from the same time, you'll start seeing a lot of these caps trimmed for the artillery. Really, from some point in later 1864, the Richmond Depot Type 3s will come in. This is one in domestic cloth with 8 buttons. It's trimmed. It makes it actually an unusual jacket. The majority of these jackets, the overwhelming majority, would have been in English Army cloth. The issue of caps follows largely the same rules, with the English Army cloth coming in around the Chancellorsville campaign and continuing through to the end of the war, but domestic cloth caps will be, they'll be made to the end of the war too, right alongside the English Army cloth caps. That being said, black hats would have been far more common, with the exception of certain units like the 1st Maryland Battalion / 2nd Maryland Regiment, which was the same unit. One small afterthought, this jacket is not exactly typical of a Richmond Depot Type 1. It lacks the pointed cuff trim, but it is the closest thing I have, so I should mention that. Now, another thing I wasn't able to mention, I don't have any examples of, would be Tate jackets, which would have been imported from Great Britain, and they would have been made in English Army cloth, and depending on the type of Tate jacket, they had a variety of types of trim, and they all actually had brass buttons because they were made in Great Britain. In the next volume of this video, I would actually like to discuss the issue of state uniforms, the certain private uniforms like commutation items or items provided, which state items are actually commutation items too, but we're talking specifically about items provided by the soldiers, as well as the use of federal uniforms, which are a lot less common than people think, and they're definitely more, the use of federal clothing is more limited to specific times and places. A quick list of book recommendations I would like to make would be Suppliers to the Confederacy by Burton Berry, Cadet Gray and Butternut Brown by Tom Arliscus, Imported Confederate Uniforms of Peter Tate and Company, Limerick, Ireland by Fred Adolphus, and Echoes of Glory, Arms and Equipment of the Confederacy, which is a Time Life book. Thank you for watching my video. Please leave a comment, and goodbye. The next book, and really the most vital book to understanding the Confederate depot system and how uniforms were acquired, issued, would be Cadet Gray and Butternut Brown, Notes on Confederate Uniforms by Thomas M. Arliscus. Echoes of Glory, Arms and Equipment of the Confederacy, which is a Time Life book and is very easy to find. And if you really want to hunt down something that's less common, Imported Confederate Uniforms of Peter Tate and Company, Limerick, Ireland by Frederick R. Adolphus. It's an excellent book. Fred Adolphus is a sweet man, but this covers those imported Tate uniforms, which are, not unusual, not hard to come by in the Army of Northern Virginia in later 1864 and 1865, and would provide somebody, if they wanted to paint historically correct uniforms with trim that were more common in Virginia, there's a good way to do it.